welcome back to the Resonant State podcast. And hopefully, this will not be put down the black hole of whatever it appears. Even Brett can't find my shows, so my shows are there. I'm going to post this on Twitter, on all my 6-7 platforms. And I appreciate everybody who's been listening and supporting this endeavor as we move towards the final end game of a very long-term strategic plan that has been going on for, I would say, several thousand years at this point. And we are kind of reaching some of the terminal junctures here. But speaking of terminal junctures and how decisions and life paths can change, sometimes even radically, I'm joined by someone who I had the great pleasure to be introduced to him through Mr. Sean McCann, and we did some shows back in the day. And this is Brett of Psyop Cinema, and he's someone who's taken, you could describe as I hate to use the word tinfoil hat cadre. I mean, actually, tinfoil does block electromagnetic frequencies. So
well, that comes from a Julian Huxley story called "The Tissue Culture King."
Mm-hmm.
Foil, yeah. So it's actually Huxley, that Julian Huxley, one of the conspirators, is actually the person from we get tinfoil hats from.
Well, and Julian Huxley also has a story about the drum and this sort of tribal group mind thing, which I talk
That's
about.
It. That's
the tinfoil hat story. Yep. So. Yep. But anyways, so we're joined here by Brett with so Psyop Cinema he's got a wonderful journal, and I'll post all the links for this, and he does excellent analysis of cinema and a lot of other things, and he does come from an academic background type of analytical framework, which I do myself, and we were just in the pre-show kind of discussing how applying some of the more rigorous type of methodologies of academic research, right? As long as you're not doing postmodern, reflexivity, God knows what stuff, and you apply it to the actual things, it can be a bit dangerous for maybe the elites, maybe for yourself, and it becomes more compelling. But it is a risk factor, and that's one of the reasons that I initially was hesitant to start my own show, because I had a window where I was getting a lot of exposure, and I just said, you know what, I don't want to get locked into this. I still want to try to get an academic job, and so I'm not going to make my own show. Well, that eagle has flown. So, but anyways, it's just a great pleasure to be here with Brett, and we're basically going to be discussing, well, basically whatever he'd like to talk about, but we're going to be looking primarily at Brett's personal and, dare I say, spiritual journey. So thank you so much for coming on the show. It's a great pleasure.
Thank you, Hans. Yeah, I mean, it's been great knowing you. And I think maybe our first show was the one we did on Don McLean's American Pie. Is that with Sean McCann? I think, and we did Angel Heart, and we've had a whole string of collaborations. And as you mentioned, the magazine is Cultural Engineering Studies. The third issue is coming out soon. Hans contributed an article on FM radio, so that'll be out, I think, in March. But yeah, so I'm the director of research at a 501c3 called the Decoding Culture Foundation, which is what publishes Cultural Engineering Studies magazine, and research broadly researching cultural engineering, right? The manipulation of values and the pushing of hidden agendas through specifically culture, as opposed to propaganda. But we focus on the Hollywood, Washington D.C. Relationship, and then I'm the co-host of the Psyop Cinema podcast, and I finished my PhD at Rice University in religion over the summer, and so we've discussed a lot of deep politics stuff and cultural engineering topics and stuff, and we can talk about that today. But I just thought I was just curious in having a discussion with you about spiritual journeys. Now, I'm an Orthodox Christian. I converted to Orthodoxy in the course of being in this program at Rice. Not because the program encouraged me, in spite of that. Um, and that was really integral though to the path of decoding culture for myself, because I mean, I don't know about you, but I mean, I grew up. I mean, nominally, my family was Episcopalian. I mean, I think my grandparents were religious people, but I could see that, the generation after them, my mom's generation, they were going through some of the motions, but they just didn't have a lot of spiritual grounding. And what happens is, it's not that secularism displaces religion. That's kind of what you're taught, at least in an old academic paradigm, that we're moving into this secular, non-religious era. And I mean, in the terms of public institutions, that's true in a formal way, right? That religion has less and less sway within the institutions. But what's actually happening in the collective psyche and in the individual psyches of the people that make up the collective psyche is culture is actually replacing religion, and culture is replacing religious culture. And who's creating um, the the culture? Well, I mean, Hollywood, the music industry, right? So to me, I became, by the time I was, certainly my early 20s, my late teens, I was quite conscious of the fact that art and music and these things were religion. For me, they were, in some level, satisfying a religious impulse. And even wanting to create things was, to me, a religious thing, was a religious endeavor. Um, but it took me a long time to see what was really dangerous and toxic about this in itself, and then specifically the kind of religion that was being the bad religion, that's being sold to us by the culture. So I mean, that's kind of the context of my spiritual journey. Is, it was rock and roll music. And well, there we are back at American Pie, right? Do you believe in rock and roll? Can music save your mortal soul? It was rock and roll music and movies and things like this that I thought, this is what sort of, in an almost inexpressible way, what sort of salvation consisted in, something to do with what these cultural products were advancing, at least what to me seemed like in their best form, you know.
But it's interesting. I'm just getting a notebook. I'm trying to write down things you say or points so I don't. Interruption is a bad thing. No, but it's absolutely fascinating. So I think I'd like to put a little more sort of flesh on the bones, so to speak, of your narrative. So I also was raised Episcopalian, and you know I have to say it's a pretty, no offense to any Episcopalians, it's kind of a it's a pretty soulless church. At least it's didn't. I never really had that feeling. I did. I had a very strong sense of a connection, but then the church itself just was, it was a social thing. And then as you go into rock and roll, the first thing you want to do is step outside, right, the mainstream and things like that. But I think we look at what you mentioned. I think there is, I think there is a shift that I think is a little bit more primary than just the, uh, just saying making culture a religion or etc. It is actually that there is a move to reduce, you could say they've generated an animalistic, consumeristic mass of humanity to move into quote unquote spiritual consumerism, to shunt people into the virtual worlds, right? And part of that, I think a big part of that is the psychedelic movement, right? We talked last night about, the guy had the Google glasses and he went insane, right? Some successful guy, but the Google glasses are telling him he's Omega Man, he's God, he's Christ, he's Buddha. He just completely ended up in the desert waiting for the aliens to come and lost his business and just destroyed his life in 3 months wearing a pair of glasses, talking to AI. So that shows a very deep level of destabilization. But I'd be very interested. Just that's a great overview. But can you? I want to kind of a little bit feel because that seems like a pretty big shift. What compelled you? What called you? And maybe starting out with your experience of psychedelics, because for me, psychedelics were the supposed to be. This is how you. This is your true religion. If you want to be a hero, go on the hero's journey. Take your
Right.
heroic dose, and do psychedelics, and then you'll find your center or find God. So please, Brett, if you don't mind going in that direction, I'd be quite interested.
Yeah, well, that's we're going into psychedelics here, and and that's right. I was painting in very broad strokes, but this culture that replaces religion, in fact, has religion, well, at one time sort of built into the background of it, where you have, you know, Crowleyite thalamic occultism is really part of the fabric of especially the music industry and the movie industry, and then what Christopher Partridge calls the occulture, um, then increasingly comes out into the open. And then here, I mean, now where we are is that these occult tropes and themes are really just, they are what the culture is. I mean, you look at the Marvel movies and stuff. I mean, it's not very hidden anymore. It's not very subtle anymore. But so when I was a freshman in undergraduate in college, like I took philosophy 101. That's what I got my undergraduate degree in, was philosophy. And within, like, I don't know, like halfway through the first semester, it occurred to me, because you're using an analytic philosophy approach and foundationalism, it was very obvious to me that there was really um, there was really no way to sort of ground anything, right? There was no way to ground, certainly not the values that Western civilization was built on, or even the kind of metaphysical and epistemological uh, foundations. It was just, there was no way to establish these at all. So the word that I learned was nihilism, and I just identified I thought it was heroic to identify yourself as a nihilist. I'm like, I'm just being honest. I'm a nihilist. I was never attracted, by the way, to all of the, the new atheism stuff, and because all of that seemed to be not quite philosophically sound, right? It didn't seem to be epistemologically sound. There's really no foundation of for anything. Um, I wasn't a scientific materialist. I was a nihilist, and so it's like I spent the next um, 4 or 5 years. It took me a while to get my undergraduate degree. I took a year off, and then I was doing part time, and so it took me about 5 or 6 years to get the degree. But anytime I was taking philosophy courses, I mean, it was like the background of me. I was like wanting to interrogate the professors on, what about this problem? What about this problem? And I just felt I was constantly encountering, intellectual dishonesty about it at one level, and or what Plato calls the lie and the soul, and book two and the Republic. But I could never quite reconcile this search for truth on this search for truth through the use of reason, which I would say is a kind of formal definition of philosophy for me, the search for truth through the use of reason. I could never quite reconcile that with this other search for truth, which was also tied up with emotions and desire for wholeness and love and these sorts of things, right? Which I pursued really through the culture. Okay, I could never quite reconcile them, even though something told me that this was somehow is or should be the same thing. It was these were really compartmentalized in a way that I couldn't reconcile. So I reached a state sometime after that, like my mid 20s, or I get to my mid 20s, and I was in a very nihilistic state, because then I was interested in the connections between philosophical nihilism and cultural nihilism and personal nihilism. And then I was in a very dark state spiritually. And I just found myself incapable of really believing in anything. And yet I was, had these aesthetic and other emotional types of impulses. I had this desire for wholeness. So I'm using these kinds of terms because this is when I start to discover like Jungian psychology and Joseph Campbell, right, hero's journey, this sort of stuff. And I think it was the Robert A. Johnson book, Inner Work, that that it wasn't just about um, learning about depth psychology and starting to get a sense of how my dreams and how fantasies and things like that speak to a deeper world, certainly than you're going to learn about in philosophy, things that just are not touched upon by analytic philosophy or much of many of the disciplines in academia. So it was depth psychology began that, but the inner workbook was like telling you how to actually start interacting with with this material. And and I started doing all this dream work, and I have to this. I mean, I stopped doing this years ago, but I have like thousands of pages of I would write the dream down and I would do like this little analysis of the dream. Then I would then I ended up having cross referencing other dreams, and I had little markers of themes. And I mean, I just did this. It became this whole. I mean, it became a very kind of neurotic exercise in itself. Or at one point in my life, when I was having physical problems, of like all I was doing all day was this dream work stuff. But what I found is that when you started to write down your dreams and analyze the archetypal material, or do amplification, I think is a term that they use in the Jungian world, these uncanny things would start to happen. Where I would turn on the TV and it would be something right out of the dream, or I'd go to the library and it just these were these synchronicities, right? Then I discovered this thing of synchronicity to the point where there seems to almost be this breakdown between your inner world and your outer world if you pursue this far enough. And there are cases of people that have gone psychotic just through dream work without any psychedelic drugs or anything else. But this clued me into the insufficiency of materialistic views of those. I mean, I wasn't a materialist. Again, I was just a more thoroughgoing nihilist, but I just couldn't believe in a spiritual world. Um, Even though I kind of tried to simulate one through music and art and movies and things like that in a way, I just couldn't believe it. Now this clued me into there was something more. And so, yeah, my interest in this sort of stuff and branched into wanting to learn about esotericism and hermeticism and occult topics, and eventually I got into psychedelics. So that was a path to me to getting into psychedelics, is wanting to go into a. Well, I mean, I started smoking marijuana, and I started doing that when I moved back to Colorado, and it was legalized. And really, I was trying to sort of treat depression, and I was curious about it, and then that became a very spiritual practice for me. I'm like, wow, this is not only does it make me feel a lot better, but I'm like, wow, this is seemingly giving me sort of more access to whatever it was I was trying to get through art, and I can combine it with art and stuff. And then, in short order, I was taking mushrooms and other psychedelics.
Brett, just to kind of bracket, to use a Husserlian term, right? So this first part of your journey, I think, is very important, and we'll get, I think, the next phase. This is our little miniature hero's journey. You're still there, correct? Right. Okay, your camera's off. But so as you go
Oh
into
yes,
this,
yes, I'm still here, Hans.
okay, great, great. So this is a really, you mentioned, there's a lot of different things, and I think I just kind of want to look at, just to go a little bit deeper into, you could say, this initial phase of discontent, but yet, nihilism is really a very, very powerful, and I would say extremely dangerous conceptual framing, potentially, right? Dangerous on many, many levels, and but just to mention, so you got, Robert Johnson, I'm familiar with this stuff, Robert Johnson, Joseph Campbell. And so in a sense, what we have are these things are provided, right? These are provided as guideposts from the culture, right? Is, you're searching, and so you're seeing, especially like analytical philosophy, right? It's pretty you could say soulless. It's very cut and dry, and you're not going to get that sap of life. But just to go a little bit more into this particular phase, so this is something that when you that's I won't talk about myself, but you start to encounter, you see things starting to manifest in the world, right? And this is the thing of the synchronicities, and the thing about it is the more you go into it, the more it's going to happen. And especially but if you could just pull I guess what I'm trying to say is maybe just go a little bit deeper into these pathways pre-psychedelic, right? But you go into this, so you're doing this dream work, and you're trying to find meaning, right? In a certain way, analytical philosophy has no meaning. I mean, and then you go into nihilism, because at least nihilism seems to have some soul. You could say nihilism has some uh, balls, so to speak. It has some kind of gravitas, right? As opposed to just, whatever, Wittgenstein and all this stuff. So, so yeah, I would just like a little bit more of that phase, I think, because I think this is where a lot of people are getting caught in, right? I mentioned the guy with the Google glasses. You see this Chat GPT psychosis, and probably a lot of these people don't have the depth of curiosity that you do, or maybe the depth of inquiry. So I think in a certain way, what we're looking at is the culture itself is kind of in moving into that phase, that kind of liminality, right? So I don't know if you could just amplify that just a little bit of the dream work, and what how did you feel, like, what you go into it and you think you're getting this, you get very excited, and then it starts to pull you in a certain way, right? If you wouldn't mind. um,
Well, I can say a few things about sort of the nihilist phase and then this transition into, we can call it kind of initial spiritual awakening. I don't want people to misunderstand those terms, because I'll use another term later called prelest, which is spiritual delusion. I think there's a great deal of delusion that goes on with. I guess it's becoming spiritually sensitized, maybe is the we should call that first phase. But I said that I could not really reconcile the part of me that was just really sincerely interested in finding truth. And you say, analytic approaches to philosophy are kind of drawing. They're also very powerful tools, and they've served me very well in life. And argument analysis, and just learning how to sort through the all of the all of the welter of information and psychological warfare that we're faced with. Being very dry and rational is a valuable asset in that. But I couldn't really reconcile the part of me that was just searching for the truth with the part of me that wanted, let's just call it, wholeness. Okay. And I don't know how much this applies to other people, but I mean, I grew up in the 1990s, and it seemed to me, because I was a passive consumer of culture and I took culture to be an organic phenomenon, that from a Jungian perspective, I would then say just sort of reflected the constellation of the collective unconscious and all that sort of stuff. I've come to understand how synthetic it actually is. And in fact, people who understand the dynamics and the tools of it, it's only natural that they're going to start manipulating it. I mean, the two are not separate. Like, understanding that there are rules and mechanisms and stuff to how culture works is inseparable from it being manipulated, because once people understand them, they're going to start trying to do that. But anyway, I'm in a naive phase with regard to culture, and it seemed to me that there was some kind of great truth that was being pushed on me from after World War II. It seems like there's a pretty obvious pattern where the norms and mores that govern our society are being progressively stripped away until there's nothing left. Such that when I was a teenager, we thought, like, the world might end in 2000, and there was gonna, and you're listening to Marilyn Manson, and it's like there's this sort of apocalypse that's happening, and what it consists in, who knows. But we're moving toward it, and it's horrifying, and it's exciting. And I can mention all kinds of other apocalyptic media, especially from the 1990s, that influenced me. Gregor Rocky's movies, The Doom Generation, and Nowhere. But it seemed to me that um, and I kept these ideas into the 2000s, because what was I going to do with them, even though the world didn't end? Uh, it was it was as if what this was all about was that society and culture were fake, and they were somehow at odds with what it was to be truly human. And as these restrictions and norms always fell away, of course, it was going to make a lot of people become animalistic, right? But then it was going to sort of make another segment of the population become more spiritualized or more refined. And, it was always about, what is rock and roll music about from the beginning, right? It's about using romantic love to replace love of God, and religion is a big thing that's going on, right? Where you can literally take religious songs and change God to like being about your sweetheart, sort of in the song. Um, so to me, like that was somehow how my desire to reach wholeness through a romantic relationship of some kind, which was, even when I had one, somehow didn't fulfill this desire for wholeness, because of course that. But anyway, so I called it romantic nihilism. Was this even this concept? I'd even theorized it. I wrote this. I wrote this manuscript. I tried to get a literary agent. I never published it when I was an undergraduate. It was about the Columbine massacre and cultural nihilism, and then like romantic nihilism was like my big idea in there. Anyway, um, so when I read Robert A. Johnson's book, like I didn't just read Inner Work, I started reading, and I read many other Jungians, Marie-Louise von Franz, et cetera. But Johnson's books are very accessible and spoke to me. And he did this series, he, she, and we. He understanding masculine psychology, she understanding feminine psychology, and then we is, I don't remember the subtitle, um, but the the he is about, uses the myth of Percival to elucidate masculine depth psychology. Okay, but we is, I believe, the one that uses the Tristan and Isolde myth to explain. It seemed like what my deepest concerns were not really addressed by a lot of the stuff that I read. I mean, whether it was academic or non-academic, it seemed like I wasn't reading the right stuff yet. I had to get into reading stuff of a more esoteric and occult and new agey nature to see these energies really being identified in any way. And I could see that this person was talking about the stuff that was going on with me, but he was telling me that you're under a delusion, actually. And he uses the myth of Tristan and Isolde and the love potion to show that this is actually what's going on in this myth, is that they're drunk on something that's creating this delusion, and it's displacing their spiritual journey into something else. And that in fact, romantic relationships are really about loyalty and having children and things like this. And it's very simple that what's happened is that your desire for God, and hence personal wholeness through God, is partially just being displaced in a way that's not fruitful and never will be. And you can't see that because you're under a delusion. It's very sobering to see that this isn't just a person dismissing these impulses. This is a person who understands them quite well and is being direct about what the problem is, and not in an unempathic way, but just in the only way that you can tell it. So this was liberating in a way, because it confirmed something I was already kind of onto, is that, part of what's been going on is I've been on a spiritual journey without recognizing it, and I've been kind of spinning my wheels, and so I need to get more conscious about doing that. And so I continued the dream work and started, reading all of Jung's alchemy stuff and reading Joseph Campbell. And then, of course, I'm still a big film buff and I'm still into music and all this stuff, but I'm trying to look at it at a depth psychology level and understand it, and turn it at a, let's call it a symbolic level. Let's call it a psychic symbolic level. These different layers of the different layers of the hermeneutic, as I would call it now. There's, I guess, entertainment is not even a layer, but there's the art layer, right? And then there's the psychic symbolic layer. Okay, and so that's kind of where I had reached, and then I'm on this personal journey and I became interested in mysticism, and so that eventually, as I kind of already alluded to in my last monologue there, that's what led me to experimenting with psychedelics. Yeah.
great. Yeah, no, I also went through a phase with Robert Johnson, dream work, etc. So maybe there is sort of a topology of so navigating a minefield of culture. But yeah, I think one of the things that you mentioned is very important is we have been raised into a cult of the self, a cult also of the the destroyed self, man against the world, the Columbine shooting. Um, Also, find fulfillment through romantic love. Your love, you're going to chase this. This is the peak of human experience, right? So there's a lot of and there's a lot of hyper focus sometimes, right? And this is one of the things you see people talking about, say trauma. I have this trauma, I have that trauma, and people get very obsessed with this, and they keep linking and going back and forth and cycling. So, and this is like one of the stages you can kind of get caught in, right? So in a sense, you enter this inquiry. And there's, we can maybe go back into, into Jungian stuff, but this is like one of the signposts, and Robert Johnson is, I know someone that knew him personally and said he was a very compelling man. Very, he really.
I actually ended up meeting someone close to me
Oh,
that knew him as well, which is the same
oh,
kind of a synchronicity. Yeah.
okay, yeah. So, and he says like he was almost like sort of like a mystic type of like, he almost, had some types of powers. But so from that stage, right? So you're going, then we'll continue with your journey here. But I think that one of the in a certain way, if you think of like, I forget the name of a game. There's like a board game. You go through and there's various moves. You can take the wrong move. You go here. You know what I mean? It's like a maze almost. You just take here. You have the path. You know what I mean? It's like there's that Borges story, the Garden of Forking Paths, right? But like, say the dream work and going into the unconscious, this is a path, and many people take that path and they continue on that path. Not But here's the thing, it is essential to be able to start to look into these things. You can't just do it on the surface of life, right? You have to take the step or the stage. I don't know if you agree with me, right? But I think it's, at least I'm looking at it sort of as a process. Certain things you can't skip them. You maybe have to go through this. Maybe you have to go through romantic love. And then finally realizing this is not it. Or it looks like you were a little bit more measured, but there's a hedonic model. Take drugs, drink, party, live the rock and roll lifestyle, break all the rules. This is freedom. This is your will. This is the true purpose of life. So, anyways, before we go into the mystical thing, I think
Well,
that's another liminal.
well, there's a lot of historical and cultural contingency to some of these sorts of what people need, or what sort of stages and what specific things that they have to interact with. I mean, some of these are, interpersonal relationships and what's going on with them are going to be different in different periods, and what people are going to be preoccupied with and how that's going to interact with their spiritual life and stuff. Is There's a lot of contingency for that. That's why I preface kind of the stuff I was saying. I don't know how much some of that applies to everybody. I will say that because I didn't fully answer your question before. You're asking me, what was it like? Like when I started doing the dream, I started actually engaging with it, right? Not just learning about these things, but when I started like engaging with it and getting my hands into the work, and I realized that like I can operate on my inner life, and it's changing things and seemingly in the outer world. This was very exciting and caused sometimes bouts of euphoria. Like people will get on drugs, because it's like, well, the Christmas season just ended. You think I always love, Scrooge when he sort of wakes up. It's just such a wonderful thing. Like this world was all around him, and he didn't see it before. So it can induce euphoria that, um, your worst fear is that all of the is that the nihilism is all really justified in a way, which is what you already believe. You already believe your worst fear, and then it's like this is just a bonus. Like you find it's not true. There really is a spiritual world. There really is something out there. You don't know what it is. It's a big ocean. Now, I also say that I had some, even in my dream work, I often when I got very euphoric, and I wanted to, of course, approach things that were more and more numinous within that world, I would start to have some very frightening experiences within the dream. I mean, I woke up in cold sweat, more than once when I was approaching some black obelisk or some huge tower with skulls at the top with an altar and things like this that I encountered in my dream. And I was doing lucid dreams. I was just doing, I had stomach issues at one point. I had a bleeding ulcer. I used my diet was really. It's another thing. It physically healing was connected to this too because I used to drink like 6 Coca-Colas a day and stuff myself, and I was in terrible physical condition. I got like a bleeding ulcer when I was in my mid 20s, and I really couldn't work. And for like a year plus, I really couldn't do very much. Like I didn't have any health insurance, and like had to keep like a little bit of peanut butter bread. Like I had to get up every 3 or 4 hours to put something in my stomach. So that helped me write my dreams down. So I'm like getting up every time a REM cycle's over, eating some peanut butter or something to stop the burning in my stomach, and then I'm writing my dreams, and I didn't have anything else to that I necessarily had to do. So I'm like spending all day doing this stuff. There was a period of, I don't know, 8 months or something probably where this was my main occupation. Like I said, I did this for on and on, or mostly on, but not all day long. But I kept that dream journal for close to 10 years. Um, yeah, and including the analysis. So yeah, it was often very, even before I got into psychedelics and chemically manipulating myself, I would have bouts of euphoria, and also some dark episodes as well through this.
That's, I guess this is my sort of opinion a little bit, is that I'm not saying there's like this is the same for everybody, but I think, you're in a culture, Heidegger talks about the thrownness, right? You are thrown into this particular world at this particular milieu, into this particular space and time with your identity, with your family heritage, and how you connect religion, this and that, how you connect with that based upon the inputs you're receiving. And again, it's very important. Like you said, the culture self seems like it's organic, like it's like the sky, it's like water. You don't realize what to what degree our reality is artificial, and that will induce nihilism. But so going from this stage, um, what how was your journey in? How deep did you get into psychedelics? And one thing we do, just to caveat, is I did a lot. I mean, I lived in India. I mean, I've done many years of all kinds of spiritual practices and all kinds of things and this and that. So I could go on and on. There are many mansions and palaces of energy. There are different dimensions. There are different spiritual dimensions. Um, but there's also, you ultimately you have to find a ground. If you don't find that ground, these things can be very dangerous. And really, they can be dangerous, you could say, to your soul, but they can be dangerous to your psyche. They can be dangerous to your actual fulfillment of what has been given to you, right? As your sort of your allotment from God's providence. So it's very important, I think, to navigate some of these things. But potentially, sometimes I think we have to go through certain phases in our life, right? You wouldn't. I mean, at least that's my outlook. Is I may have had to go through all this terrible suffering and this and that, but I'm here, and all this was maybe necessary of something I had to learn. But we'll step back from my, I wouldn't call that a screed, but for my, just touching on some of these points and saying that, and again, we live in a culture. Our culture is not designed with the best interest of humanity at large. I would say that is one thing to understand. There are things where you have cultures that are more, maybe it's been a long time, but at least you can find a straight path through the given culture. I think it's very difficult to find that in, especially 1990s America. Very difficult, depending on where you're at. So anyways, the dream work into psychedelics, how did you make that transition? What called you to make that transition? And what was that like experientially for you?
Well, yeah, one note there is so to what you were just saying and what you asked me before. Um, and you have to go into the cultural engineering side of things to make this point. So the ever since the 19th century, the atheism that's been promoted out of elite circles and of academia and out of the sophisticated atheism basically that's spread through the culture um, is part of a psyop because you learn that the elites are not atheists, right? You learn that we mentioned Julian Huxley and the circles around him, and then you learn about all of these legacy families and stuff, and they're not actually atheists. They're not Christians, but they're not atheists. Let's just say they adhere to alternative religions. Okay, so what is the purpose of spreading this atheism in the culture? Is that it's really just the dissolve and coagulate formula. Is what happens is when you really get people to nihilism, right? Because it promotes nihilism. It's not just disbelief in the Christian God. It's getting people to disbelieve in any kind of spiritual value at all. And such people are ready to believe in anything. And that's why I was getting euphoric to have anything happening um, at all. A book I hope I can reference a little more in the course of the discussion, Father Seraphim Rose's Orthodoxy and the Religion of the Future, which is very influential on me. He's writing about this, Father Seraphim is saying that this religion of the future that's being constructed really by demonic agencies, but through elite forces and through, I mean, he was a student of Alan Watts, and so he saw the counterculture religion and this religion that's going to consist of everything from UFOs to Pentecostal speaking in tongues and all this stuff that he's talking about. Um, what it Sorry, I got distracted thinking about uh, uh, some other elements of that. Oh, but I remember in the book, yeah, he interviews a Pentecostal minister. Or no, he doesn't interview him. He's quoting another interview, but some guy is even bringing up the problem. Like, how do you know that this isn't coming from demonic agencies? These phenomena, to the extent this stuff is real, that it's not just um, hornswoggle. He's like, well, I'm just glad something's happening, and that's it. That's the thing. People get so euphoric that like something is happening, and that's part of why psychedelics are so appealing to a people that have been subjected to the atheism and the nihilism for a prolonged period of time, because we are fundamentally spiritual beings, right? That we are seeking spiritual wholeness. Like that is what's at the core of our hardware, if you will. Excuse the metaphor, but that's who we really are at the deepest level, is spiritual religious beings. We're seeking to be in contact with God, and when the forces that mediate our psychic life and our physical life prevent that, um, it there's a pressure that builds up, and then we're willing to embrace we're we're willing to embrace spiritual paths that aren't necessarily healthy. And so that's the psyop, right? That's what's going to get people into the religion of the future and what's getting them into it. And that's a problem with psychedelics, is that yes, people take these things and stuff is happening and they feel great at first. And I mean, it's also the problem. I just think that it's not very advisable as a spiritual practice. I can't, it, as you'll see, it was instrumental kind of in getting me out of, I can't be an atheist anymore, partly because I've taken those drugs. So that's a good thing. But then they ended up almost derailing my entire spiritual life. So it's just not really advisable. I don't think that what I'm getting into the politics of it. I mean, I don't believe in banning plant substances. Generally speaking, I don't necessarily believe they should be sold retail either. But it's really, they're just not advisable because you know I the as I've already said. I mean, to me the spiritual path was so intertwined with seeking knowledge, right? And that's so important to the occult. That's something we've all gotten through Western culture, and it's very Faustian, and that's a dangerous thing, because the proper way to go on this path, I'm not telling you that I'm doing it properly. I'm just saying I know that the proper way to approach this path is through moral purification, right? That's what we really need to be focused on, is moral purification and illumination, as we the in Orthodoxy, we talk about the path to theosis or deification as purification, illumination, and deification. Illumination accompanies this, but the seeking of, that's a left-hand path, right? That seeking of stuff you haven't earned is just trying to storm the kingdom. And all of these stories, though we hear the old version of the Faust story and any number of other stories about some magician who destroys himself, uh, trying to get powers and knowledge and things that don't properly belong to him. He doesn't know what to do with. They're summoning demons to do stuff for him. Those are cautionary tales that really are allegories of how things work in the spiritual world. So psychedelics are part and parcel of that kind of preless and that kind of dangerous left-hand path of trying to get. But again, I can't begrudge people that because they're suffering under, whether they want to or not. It's not even a matter of conscious belief. They have a culture that has spiritually stultified them, and they get something out of taking these psychedelics and out of these drugs that maybe people in another era wouldn't necessarily get in the same way. But that kind of thing led me to take psychedelics and want to go deeper into the stuff I'm already onto, this hero's journey, path that I was on, and trying to get a closer relationship to God, and go deeper into the spiritual world and understand it more. And it was just gaining more knowledge to me was inseparable from spiritual attainment. I needed to get more and more knowledge, understand the principles of how this stuff worked, and I understood now it wasn't really intellectual, although it was not intellectual. It was intuitive. Okay, and that's what these hermetic and occult systems are built on, a kind of higher form of the intellect that subsumes the lower intellect. And I could see all the things I was doing that I had been doing in the past, my study of philosophy and history and all these things, is building up on all of this. And this is part of some of the delusion in the preless, that this is your destiny and this is your fate. So initially my early forays into psychedelic space were very euphoric, and I wasn't quite, and I'll tell you, like, the big mystical breakthrough I had, I wasn't quite there yet. But I certainly wasn't an atheist anymore, but I wasn't necessarily cured of the atheism and the nihilism yet. And like, it was weird, like I was basically becoming a kind of hippie, which was amusing to me, because I never would have thought of myself like that before. But and I was very enthusiastic about psychedelics, and was thinking everybody should be using these and should be using marijuana, and it's gonna save the world, and all that kind of. So that was the early phase of my journey, and I'm reading, and I'm still studying depth psychology stuff, but getting now more into hermeticism and things like that in that early phase. To the extent I was reading stuff, I was getting more and more into hermetic stuff. And and then Terence McKenna and reading all the psychedelic literature, getting all those books. I never got into Timothy Leary, who I can talk about another occasion. I wrote about in my transhumanism book. I've always thought was a sinister figure, but I got very deep into Terence McKenna, a little bit of Sasha Shulgin and things like that.
It is a sort of interesting, going back to that thrownness, right? So in a sense, we are here in this particular space, time, this historical juncture, and there are a lot of dead ends there. So, uh, Brett, what, in terms of your psychedelic experiences, could you just maybe talk about a few, or maybe both good and bad, and if any of them compelled you to, what compelled you to stop that particular um, segment, so to speak, of your journey? Because I mean, I know many people still, it just becomes integrated into their lives, right, to a certain degree. But what was um, and again, I could talk about my own experiences. I'll save that for later. But I just like to know, like, what was the one thing, right, is the first of all the realization that there's huge amount of inner space, right? There's a huge, vast inner world, um, and you get sort of an entree into it. You get certain types of sensory perception that some of them are just there. They're just in your unconscious. But could you just give me two like framing, like say a good, bad, and ugly, or like the psychedelics, or if you just walked away from it, and if you had like a dark experience, you had a light experience, what made you turn from that? But what could you just describe a bit of what you were getting out of it when you thought you were really gaining a lot from that?
Well, yeah, there really are. There's like two framing experiences. There's two key experiences, and yeah, and we don't have time to go into all the phenomena. But I was very interested in the visual phenomenon, closed eye visuals, and all that was very exciting, and experimenting with all that kind of stuff. But and I was trying to build up the dosage, that I was taking, right? Yeah, trying to get toward the heroic dose, and so I took it also depends on the potency of what you're taking. So actually, the breakthrough experience wasn't necessarily the highest dose I'd ever taken, but they were much more, I think, potent mushrooms than I had taken before. And at the peak of the experience was, I was the person who was with me. Like I was able to read this person's mind and tell them what they were thinking, and so that was incredible. And I could and then I sort of uh, felt myself uh, leave myself, like I was outside of my mortal, like my soul had gotten sort of a purchase outside of myself, and I immediately knew, and I was in contact with. Uh, um, and I know McKinnon talks about talking to the mushroom. I mean, who knows what you're talking to, but I still think that I was talking to some benevolent angelic force, or maybe this was the Holy Spirit. But it seemed to me I was talking to the font of all wisdom. And I say talking to, it's not even, of course, it's not like talking like this. It's not even like mentally talking. It's like, um, there was a total fluidity. I felt like I had the sense I could know anything. And I'm asking it questions, but it's like I'm asking it things to satisfy. I know that I'm going to go back to this limited mortal neurotic state, and I'm trying to reassure this person who's suffered greatly under the pressures of a very stultified spiritual life, and of atheism, and of questioning whether there's a God and a soul. And it was just it's a Stephen DeLay, I mentioned to you, he talked about, he never used drugs, but he had this spiritual experience. And we were talking about his kind of mystical experience. And there's this thing, it's like, it's funny that we, especially philosophical people, there's this big question, does God exist? And all these proofs for God. It's like when you're in this state, it is so clear and so transparent to your mind that God exists. It's um, like it, it's the most, it's more obvious than that you exist and that this room exists, right? And in fact, so I'm actually asking this wisdom, this question, like, does God exist? And the answer is almost like, it's almost gesticulating, if I can say it though. It's like, well, it's like, right? But then the voice added this thing. It said, I don't know why people lie about it. And that struck me because to my intellectual mind, to my normal egoic mind, it's like, well, people don't lie about it, they're ignorant or whatever. No, it's like and I got it, like we're actively, or whatever, we're using so much of our psychic energy to actively suppress the truth of God. That's what's going on, is this active lying to ourselves, which again is there are mechanisms that are bigger than the individual ego, and there are forces bigger than the individual ego, which are part of that. But we're actually actively suppressing this most obvious of all truths to ourselves at all times. And so it was clear as day that God existed. And then, I asked, well, is there a soul that survives the death of the body? And the answer was, well, you're here you are. And I couldn't remember my name. I couldn't tell you. And it was very scary as well. And I was very concerned. I was like, I was saying to you, but I'm gonna be like I'm never gonna go back to my body. I'm very scared. It's like, oh no, no, you're going back. And I was like, yeah, but I'll be crazy when I go back. No, no, like you'll be crazy. You'll be. And it did tell me things. It was like, but don't do this drug again for like 6 months. And and it also, in not only this experience, but some other ones that I went very deep. Like whatever I was talking to was even telling me not to use this drug in a way, because I think the voice of truth doesn't talk to you, doesn't yell at you, and it doesn't manipulate you, and it doesn't try to push you. It speaks as that small still voice that we read about in the Bible. Um, it intimates that you don't need to do this, right? But it was as if there was a sympathy with the need of me to discover this in some direct way because I didn't have any belief, I didn't have any faith, and and then there's a concept of faith too that you find in esoteric and psychedelic circles. It's sort of trusting experiences you've had because William James, who's the great exponent of mystical experience within a more respectable academic setting. And when James gives his the four marks of mystical consciousness, one of them is it's temporality. So these are short lived. There are, well, and you can talk about Eastern traditions and well, we can debate what state some of these people are in. But I mean, in the church, we have saints. Not all of the saints were people that necessarily achieved high levels of mystical experience. Many of them did, though. Saint Seraphim of Sarov, et cetera. And we hear from them that sometimes they're not always in this state, especially when they're forced to become bishops and things like that. It very much interferes with their ability. So there's a temporality. You're not always going to be in that state, even when you have that kind of knowledge. You're not always able to be in that state. So this was a reassuring experience, and there are all sorts of phenomena that are happening. Of course, I can't. It's just endless phenomena were happening during this experience. I thought I saw, like Jacob's ladder sort of opening up, and it was odd to me as I wasn't in a very Christian frame of mind. I haven't said this, but I never really abandoned Christ. I just had a sort of perennialist. I developed a kind of perennialist view of Christ and Buddha, and it's all kind of the same thing. But I still held to the figure of Christ as the sort of superior uh, paradigm of mystical wisdom and the mystical path and that sort of thing. But I wasn't in a particularly biblical frame of mind. But I was told that these were like the prophets or something that were going up and down this ladder, and they were the ones who could access. So I was having all these. This was happening right at the same right at the same time. And I felt that I had discovered the truth of, Plato's theory of forms was also seemed to be very apparent to me, that something like Plato's theory of forms was true, that everything is a kind of lower level instantiation of these higher levels of forms, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But that breakthrough mystical experience was the breakthrough. That was sort of the turning point spiritually for me. And that was in 2014. And then New Year's Eve 2015, beginning of 2016, I I would have, I mean, I use mushrooms several times in between then, uh, and then I would have this diabolical experience, which I can talk about as well. But that was the kind of turning point, spiritual experience, catalyzed by psilocybin mushrooms, that I had.
It's very um, I believe that it, there is, you want to call it allowance. There's things, if you do them without bad intention, out of ignorance, as long as you hear the message. If you don't, there's consequences. And so just, in terms of the, psychedelic experience, so it sounds like, overall, you had a good experience. I mean, I was, you know, it, I got involved with some kind of rainbow tribe guru my freshman year of college. This guy was like, in his 60s. He'd take us out to the forest and we'd take LSD, and he had known all these guys. I think he even knew Leary, and we'd, cosmic consciousness. And I mean, I ended up fleeing America to go to India because I finally, it got very, very dark, right? But just to, highlight, the light and dark of that. And there, I won't go into too much detail, but I had a thing where I was actually elevated into a very, I'd say almost like a spiritual mystical state all around me. And this went on for like a week or two. I was on no drugs. I was completely sober, but I was sort of elevated. But here's what happened is I started everything I'd done wrong in my life, any moral shortcoming, any, that inner examination. And that's what somehow A, knocked me out of it. B, I couldn't have withstood it. But so these things, you get these snapshots, you get these previews, but ultimately, A, you can't really, some of these higher states, you can't really function in normal day-to-day life. But B, it's sort of back to the ground level of the, moral, and even, being very honest and being very clear about your decisions, about your words, about your thoughts, about your deeds, about your intentions and things like that, which we don't need to go into that point. But I just want to say that, it's very, you can get these doors open. But another thing just to call to mind is that you, these have been used for thousands of years, whether it's ayahuasca, Santo Daime. They've been used as ways to connect and open up portholes between dimensions, to engage in the act of ritual possession, or to be, and usually it's going to be the shaman that's doing that. And well, the shaman is a particular type of outlier, and the shaman is one of those kind of anomalous liminal figures. Not everybody is a shaman. No way. I mean, this is a very, very limited thing, but they've been used for a long time for especially this, to, okay, open doorways, occasionally for healing, but a lot of times you want to ancestral spirits, you want the nature spirits, particular entities, particular deities, they're being summoned. When you take that, your energetic, your bioenergetic field, because we have this is, you look at this, the saints, they have halos. That's because we have this luminous field of energy that's around us. You may not see it, you may not believe in it, it's there. So we have as a component of our physical body, we have a non-physical element. And this, especially if you're in a materialistic paradigm, to realize, well, we're not alone here, and there's a lot of powerful, or even not even that powerful, there's a lot of other entities, and there definitely is a force for evil, demonic, diabolic, and you can also become very easily deluded or manipulated
You
unless you
look
return
at
to center.
well, I mean, you look at the Aztecs, right? Who were their nobility, not just the priests, their nobility, were using these things widely. And we have every reason to trust what the Spanish Chronicle says, that, I mean, these people were, dosing and doing all these human sacrifices, and they had gone insane. It looks to me that you can have collective insanity through the widespread use of these, which is what concerns me about the popularization of psychedelics and this new wave of psychedelia. And even, of course, you hear about all the microdosing in Silicon Valley, which I think is also dangerous. In fact, that you can actually become affected in ways that are less perceptible to yourself. But yeah, I think you can induce a collective psychosis through these drugs as well. Yeah.
Well, Silicon Valley, I mean, also, and I was going to write an article about this. I mean, there's active process of trying to invoke spiritual entities to inhabit the AI, right? And so this, there's a big resurgence of pushing for psychedelics, for, therapy, this and that. But I mean, for me, as for whatever I've gone through in my life, I mean, I've had to, like, I was talking to one of my friends, and she's like having, people are just suffering so much. But I say, pick up the sword of your will and your spirit, and just move away from this. Take the suffering and just you have to continue. If you don't have a faith, faith means you're just reaffirming what you know. So maybe this is helpful in terms of providing that experience. But um, if you look again with the Chat GPT psychosis, you look at how people are so disconnected, and so you had an approach that looks very measured. You were doing something for a particular purpose. You weren't just going to raves and going to parties or just hanging out. It seems like you had some methodical approach.
Well,
But anyways, and I'll stop there. But please talk about your bookend, your diabolical experience also
well,
with that.
it wasn't measured. I mean, like, um, especially after that, like, I waited a while to do it again. I was using smaller doses, but it was like it was becoming a kind of neurotic relationship. Like on the one hand, I did want to, have that kind of contact that everybody really wants, right? They want to get close to God, whether they articulate it that way themselves or not. And then on the other hand, I was becoming a part of the psychedelic culture, and you're encouraged. Like it's almost like that's your heroism is that your willingness to continue to use these drugs and to take higher doses of them. And like I listened to hundreds of McKenna's talks and read all his books. I know a lot of people found Terrence to be hypocritical because I guess he had actually stopped. He kept using DMT and those, but he'd stopped using mushrooms after like 1989 or something because and people treated that as hypocritical. So that's just gives you a sense of the norms that govern psychedelic culture. So I had a neurotic relationship to these drugs, and that's really what led me into the, as I call it, the diabolical experience. My grandfather had just died, and I had a girlfriend break. I was just in a very bad state of mind, and I was about to start this graduate program in history when I ended up getting my master's in history before I went on to a PhD in religion. And I wanted to kind of get rid of this. I had this very large mushroom, just one. I just wanted to get rid of it kind of before and because I knew I had this neurotic relationship. I just need to get rid of this thing. And I actually tried to give it away to people. I tried to give it to someone and they're supposed to take it. They didn't take it. And it was like, so I'm like, I figure I have to take it. And, I drove up to this friend's house in Colorado Springs, and I just I didn't have any idea what I was doing. I thought, hey, let's go to the movies, whatever. And I take it one morning, and we went to go see. No, I'll tell you this, right. I didn't make it very far into this, but we went to go see that the first of the Star Wars sequels, The Force Awakens, right? And it was really kicking in. And then I watched this. This is when the diabolical experience unfolded. Is um, the trailer for X-Men Apocalypse, which again this is part of the stuff that inspired me to do Psyop Cinema and stuff. And I'll tell you that too, right? Because I learned later. You can watch the audio commentary with Brian Singer that there's all of this inaudible sound that has been put into the movie, and beginning in the 1990s, there's peer-reviewed academic articles about how sound that's not on the audible spectrum can affect brain states, and of course, the military government, they've known about this for a long time. But it was clear to me. It's hard, I say clear because you're in, there's a lot of paranoia that kicks in the experience and a lot of delusions. So who knows? But even reviewing it afterwards, I'm pretty sure this is what clued me into the fact that we're being manipulated, not just through narrative and stuff. Like we're being manipulated through audiovisual techniques at a very deep level on the screen. This clued me into it because something was happening to my psyche, which wasn't just the drug; it was my drugged mind interacting with the screen. But like I don't know how to. I mean, I'm not going to be able, as you understand, like these experiences are not easily articulable, and I could spend all day talking about this one, and still only convey so much information. So I have to speak in an elliptical way about it. But it was like I experienced the apocalypse. And this also clued me into what the apocalypse programming is about. Like when you make people think the world is ending all the time, that makes them ripe to be reprogrammed. to reprogram their values. This is why we're always here. This is why as Jay Dyer points out, every one of these elite books and his elite book series, they always begin with everything's in a crisis. Everything's in a crisis. We got to act now. When you put people in that constant frame of mind, they're very ripe to be, you're depatterning them. They're very ripe to accept whatever solution you have to offer them and whatever new order you have to offer them. But really, the apocalypse character on the screen, the apocalypse character is announcing himself that I am called Ra and I've been called Krishna. And by the way, like some like Indian conservative group protested and got them to take the Krishna part out. So it's not in the movie. I even looked that up because I'm like, I rewatched it years later and I'm like, what? That's not in there. I know I saw him say that in the trailer. And then I watched the trailer. It is in the trailer. And then I read that, yeah, some like, so it's this figure that represents as a type of Satan, it's a type of the devil, who's declaring himself to be all these gods, all at the same time. And what the experience was conveying to me is a pure determinism, that there's no such thing as free will, that time is all looped together. There's maybe different sort of, it was almost too like the sort of multi-world Everett thing. It was like there's different worlds and different timelines and whatever. Like I was seeing like other timelines in which this event, quote unquote, happened, but in a different location for me, and it was inevitable this was going to happen. And so and I can't talk about this without talking about Psyop Cinema type of stuff, because what Hollywood is doing at the level of what I call religious engineering. We talk about cultural engineering. Religious engineering is a subset of cultural engineering that's all about re-engineering people's religious values. And at the most fundamental level, what the Hollywood religious engineering campaign is about, its chief technique is to destroy the soul. We call it the death of the soul is the term that we use, this trope that comes up in so many movies, the death of the soul. You see that the eye being put out in the horror movies, and it's all about attacking your soul. The eye is the window to the soul, and Christopher Nolan movies are really foreground this thing about the death of the soul. But humans are made in the image of God. So if you want to destroy people's souls, destroy the image of God in front of them through their eye, through their perception. And it's like what it was doing to me right there, this attack on the image of God within me and this attack on my soul. This is what it's doing in slow motion to everybody. I realized that later, but this was so traumatic right away, because this what just seemed to be Satan just invaded me and attacked me and declared itself to be God. And here we go, Bryan Singer again, right? Bryan Singer directed it. Bryan Singer, credibly accused of being a predator. He made The Usual Suspects, which has the famous line about the greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing people that he doesn't exist, which is in, I think the Church Fathers say something like that too somewhere. But really the greatest trick the devil wants to pull is to convince you that he's God, right? Is to get you to worship him as God, like he tries to get Christ to worship him in the desert. So in a nutshell, I mean, that was the experience. I also thought I was going to have a seizure. I was just like, this was like, I was just going nuts, and I can't, and it, all this stuff with the X-Men, and I can't even describe the helmet, the MK Ultra stuff, we're our nervous system is an electronic grid, and everything is being run by electricity. Just all this stuff that was happening. I had to get out of the movie theater, and I got out of there, and I was just like really shattered. And I was alone. My friend wasn't very helpful, but I've come to forgive him. I don't blame him, because I couldn't deal with a person in my state either. But for really the next year, it was like, I mean, I was nuts. Like, I'm not nuts, like I was psychotic, but I mean, I was afraid of religious symbols. I was afraid of electricity. I was afraid of the outlet. I was in a very shattered state. I worked at a hotel at the time. I was doing that graduate program, which was good. It was kind of grounding. It just kept me at an intellectual level. And, I stopped studying any occultism or anything like that because I was afraid of it. And I would, like, when I was at my hotel job, I would put like the most kind of lo-fi music on, or like Japanese Kyoto music or something that was very, very calming and very, very relaxing. My boss in the past had complained like I was putting my music was too loud. Now they were complaining the music was too soft that I was putting on. But see, then, so this is where the next layer of pre-lust and delusion kicks in, is that then I started about a year later when I was like able to kind of, you know, recover to some extent and wipe myself off. And I didn't want to accept, rightly so, I didn't want to accept this attack on the image of God, that had come from what I could only recognize now as some kind of demonic thing. Because see, that's the other thing. Let me just make this footnote. Sorry to be rambling, but this is important. The problem, many problems with the psychedelic culture, but one of the big problems is its thoroughgoing unwillingness to even consider, let's call it the demonic thesis, that there are malicious, malevolent entities out there that can possess you, that can deceive you, that can do all kinds of stuff to you, and oh, it's all good, and get past, union of opposites, and don't think anything. No, like, and the fact that they're not willing to consider the thesis, because the thesis is so dangerous to their practice and their culture, and they're so scared of Christianity, right? They're so scared of Christian traditionalism, basically. That was what part of what made me vulnerable too, is that I was unwilling, because I'd had some experiences leading up to that which weren't traumatic, but they were troubling, and I wasn't really paying enough attention. I was just telling myself a story, that, not to ignore that or something, and then I really made myself vulnerable to a full-on assault like that. Um, but so then I'm trying to, a year or so later, I'm trying to recover. I'm trying to get my bearings again, and I really get into this Gnosticism stuff, right? Because the Gnostics, the ancient Gnostics, and not to mention various neo-Gnostic groups, they have a problem with this idea of a false god that pretends to be the devil and all this. So now I'm in this sort of spiritual disorientation, we can call this. I've been shaken up and disoriented spiritually, and I'm thinking, okay, this is the way to sort of recover the image of God, is through some kind of Gnostic path where I can recognize certain expressions of God as really the devil, but then there's some God above God, as the Gnostics say. There's some sort of higher principle. And so that leads me down this heretical path of deep pre-lust that will eventually get me into kind of dark occult stuff and flirting with that. And that's what when you actually read the literature, the ancient literature from the church fathers and Nag Hammadi as well on the ancient Gnostics, you'll see that you have this mixture of syncretism, which is extreme asceticism and extreme rejection of materiality in the world, and this idea of God as completely separate from the world, and creation as being bad, and God has nothing to do with creation, and sort of Platonic emanationist metaphysics to go along with it. And then there's this other attitude about, well, if matter doesn't matter, so you could just sort of do anything. And so then you have this sort of black mass stuff that and eating and this is in Epiphanius is talking, I think they're called the Borborites or something. They're doing all, and there's other groups that were doing this, and those are not mutually exclusive. Those are actually completely compatible, and I believe one will lead you to the other uh, if you ignore the truth and you ignore the problem of sin and things like this, and you subscribe to the false theology of the Gnostics and stuff, it eventually will lead you, I think, into kind of dark occultism. That's why this is confusing to people from the outside, how Gnosticism has anything to do with dark occultism. But I've actually experienced it. You're sort of you end up trying to redeem the figure of Satan. Even my friend Jason Horsley, who's a good guy and is on a real sincere spiritual path and embraces Christ at a certain level. Like, I think he's caught in this too, where he's like, well, why can't we forgive Satan, and why can't we rehabilitate Satan? And anyway, like, but so that's what this is. And you probably need to intervene here and get us back on track. But this is what's going to lead me to that program at Rice University, is this phase, the phase of spiritual disorientation following the diabolical psychedelic experience, the Gnostic spiritual disorientation phase that ends up with me at least flirting, and more than flirting, with dark occult stuff. I'm not doing any harmful practices to people, but I'm harming my own soul, and that's what leads me to the program. At the Gnosticism stuff is what's going to lead me to the program at Rice University.
That's very important, discourse there because there's so much, I just advise the listeners. By the way, if you search the resident state on Google, it will come up. I just did that, so at least I'm not totally throttled. But this pathway, where you get the revelation of there is you are being manipulated in a certain way, psychically poisoned or psychically seduced by the culture. And the difficulty, this is where this Gnostic dualism, you can look at Philip K. Dick and the three stigmata of Palmer Eldritch, right? So the whole, it's like a simulation theory, and basically this evil God is the actual creator of the physical world. And then you get the two gods, and ultimately, I think the difficulty is with this is there's other phases where you get an inner identification with demonic energies or forces or whatever, and this becomes in yourself, and you can even have a very spectacular life in a material setting. You can have lots and lots of pleasure, but you get this inner identification with the demonic or the satanic, however you want to say. And so the Gnosticism, the perception that there's, in a sense, we do live. I mean, I had to go through this. It was the main reason I went to India, is I just seeing this, the world is poisoned around us, right? And and so it's, to recognize that when you open these doors, they are potentially very dangerous, and dangerous in ways you may never even realize your entire life if you don't wake up from this delusional space. Okay. And I'll just add one anecdote. So I went to this, you know, uh, this ayahuasca Church of Santo Daime. My brother took me there. It was the most terrifying experience of my life. I was completely terrified of, if I felt any kind of spiritual energy or anything, I had to run. It was just, so anyways, this Church of Santo Daime is a cult that developed. It's one of offshoot of many various cults that developed in there was the rainforest by these, sort of slaves. They fuse Christianity with some type of paganism. They drink ayahuasca as their sacrament, and they sing these songs. These songs are actually spiritual doorways. So during this 3 days, I was trapped in this farmhouse in the middle of nowhere in Maryland. Like, it was, it started out very nice. They played some relaxing music, lie down and listen to the music, and then you have the song start, and you're segmented. And there's a picture of Virgin Mary, and there's a picture of Christ, and there's the cross. It is not. It's kind of a weird cross, double cross. But as that went on, they start to say, now we're going to summon the spirits, and so within these songs, they open up astral gateways. So I experienced this directly. This portal would open up above the center of the ring, and I would see these spirits come down and possess people. When that spirit hit a person, they would go into convulsions. They would start dancing. I mean, I could see it. One guy got possessed by a spirit of a Native American. He tried to kill me in the bathroom, and he was speaking Navajo. Okay, but they were literally, he's like, just let him come in, share your space, share your space. And I just was like, I got to get the hell out of here. I was trapped there, and my brother, he was just enjoying the buzz. He's like, yeah, this is great, bro. He was just there for the high. I'm like, and I don't think anybody else, I don't know if anyone else was that sensitive to what was actually happening. But then finally, what really flipped me out, I tried to escape. I couldn't escape because they had guards. So you try to get out of the place there, they come and they bring you back. You can't get away. You're there. You're in the middle of nowhere. You're not driving anywhere. And, they had this ayahuasca they brought from the rainforest. So I go up, and Jonathan, the guy who's doing it in Oregon, he got it legalized. I go up to, you get your dose. They sing the Daime song, and sitting right next to him was this giant Baphomet, like living Baphomet, sitting right next to the priest guy, offering the drink. And I'm seeing this Baphomet, like just like sitting there, like 3 dimensions, smiling, hey, what's up? And so I took the drink, and then that Baphomet entity, like it just came over my entire body. But it said, you're going to have anything you want in your life. You'll have all power. You'll have all wealth. You'll become as a living God in this lifetime. And it was this very powerful force and very tempting. And I freaked out. I tried to escape, and the people were saying, "Oh, it's just your shadow side. Embrace the shadow. Accept the shadow. No, this is not. There's nothing out there. This is just you, and this is what you're afraid of in your own life." But it was, I mean,
And this is so important. I want you to go. But this is so important. People understand this is the claptrap that characterizes all the psycho spiritualities and all the psychedelia, and it is a dangerous lie. This cultivated spiritual retardation that makes you vulnerable to possession by malevolent spirits. Yeah.
well, absolutely. And so again, with this Daime, so you're singing these songs, right? And so again, it turns out that the guy, that this particular branch of this cult was before he was a black magic sorcerer. Okay, he was a sorcerer. He killed, he was a very high level, powerful black magician, Satanist. Supposedly he converted. As I did further research, it turns out no. People say he didn't. I know personally 3 people that attended these things. They're permanently insane. People got possessed. And you even get smaller entities, and they're attached to you. Um, and you know, this sounds weird to people that haven't experienced it. It is absolutely real. There is no, now you have to be very careful, the level of discernment. This is something that I just say to people, you don't want to see into this other world. Live simply, live cleanly, within the measure you have in your life, and do the best you can. And then if you need to see something to be revealed, but anyways, so that Baphomet experience, and then time stopped. So I was in this frozen time that would not end, and it was infinite. And I went outside, and I kept saying, I'm a being of light. I'm a child of God. I will not accept these forces because they're very powerful. The guards came after me, and they brought me in. I said, when is this going to stop? When is this going to stop? It was like this limbo phase, and it seemed it went on for years. And it was just like, and then there's a lady, and she was screaming, and I thought they were doing a human sacrifice. I don't know if they were. And then the next day, the last day, they're wearing these like purple and black suits with these things. I realized this is a satanic cult. This is a purely satanic cult. This is a direct manifestation of the diabolical. And it took me a couple years to get away from just a fear of anything. I just want to be completely materialistic, completely just rational, and I will not. And if I even sense energy, even just going to church, I went to a Greek Orthodox church, and I had very, very powerful experience there. But also that I couldn't, I had to, like, I said, I can't, I got to step away. I have to just be in the material plane, but I couldn't be because I'd already crossed that other side. So it, just again, you know, there's a guy named Adam Green. I mentioned him on one show, and he's making fun. So you have Alex Jones and Tucker Carlson kind of promoting psychedelics, and this Adam Green guy's like, these guys are all just on mushrooms. There's no demons out there. This is all bullshit, blah blah blah. And he's mocking it. And I did a commentary thing I just mentioned. I said, when you find out this stuff is real, then you talk to me, because you're mocking something that is also going to encourage people to take it, okay, or to not recognize it. Unless you really get a deep grounding, and that grounding has to come, you're not going to find it in your own little fragile human shell ego. No way. You can't withstand these energies from that standpoint. No matter how strong you are, what's going to happen, you'll become enveloped by these entities, and you will lose your soul. And this is the whole game plan. And I think that's the whole warfare. I was a bit long there. Sorry, Brad, but go ahead.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I'm glad you told that story, because yeah, it very much complements the narrative that I have. And one of the things that I guess cured me of that the ethos of psychedelic heroism too. Is like you're saying, you when you go far enough into this, you see that you're dealing with infinite dimensions and you know, legions of entities and things like that that you can't integrate, and you can't, what are you doing this for? You know, to me, if there was anything, and I'm not omniscient, so I can't say what's necessarily good for me or bad for me, or how things could have gone differently or better or worse. But I mean, the positive thing I take away from psychedelics is just um, thoroughly convincing me in the existence of the spiritual world, the and the existence of God, and the reality of psychic life. And but beyond that, um, you know, beyond whatever was necessary to achieve that, uh, I realized it was just, I was just doing this to prove something, um, and also to feel something. And it was yeah, it was just a, it was a becoming it was becoming a practice that defeated its own purpose, you know, for me. But yeah, none of these sort of things, none of these sort of things surprised me. But yeah, that's the, so that the big danger is, yeah, it opens yourself up to, I mean, short of spiritual possession, you open yourself up to basically being manipulated and messed with by these entities in more subtle ways, um, you know, as well. So yeah, I mean, thanks for, yeah, thanks for telling that story. But the program at Rice, so I, you know, I just gotten my master's in, or I was on the way to finishing my master's in history, and I'm trying to think what to do next. I was getting that because, you know, I need to kind of get more seriously gainfully employed, and I figured, well, I'll become a teacher, master's, I can go teach community college, or maybe I can find a prep school or something like that to teach high school history or something. um, I had a lot of reservations about the academy and the school system and stuff like that, but I'm trying to find the best compromise in life that I can. And then I see this program, actually, because I listened to that uh, Eon Bites Gnostic Radio podcast with Miguel O'Connor, and I listened to the Occult of Personality podcast, I think is the name of it. And I also listened to Buddha at the Gas Pump. These are the podcasts that I'm listening to, and that's for like when I'm at work too. I'm listening to these podcasts, and I multiple people from Rice University come up, namely, you know, April DeConnick, who's my initial advisor, who's one of the leading scholars of Gnosticism in the country, and then Jeff Kripal, who would end up being the chair of my committee when the other chair, Professor John Stroop, God rest his soul, passed away. Um, I hear them in these podcasts at Rice University, and this program keep coming up, and I look into it, and I'm like, you know, they have this certificate in Gnosticism, esotericism, and mysticism, and they're talking about unconventional wisdom, and basically, like, this is one of the, it's a niche. It's not the only thing that, I mean, they do Black studies and other kind of typical stuff in their Department of Religion, but there's this niche that comes out of religious comparativism, the Chicago school, you know, Mircea Eliade, because Kripal, you know, comes out of University of Chicago, and Mircea Eliade was almost, had passed away when Kripal was there, but he was, Wendy Doniger was his mentor, and you know, Bill Parsons, Chicago is there. He was on my committee as well, mysticism, and
Brett, sorry to interrupt.
yeah,
Could you just, for the audience, because Mircea Eliade is a very, very seminal and
mhm.
important figure, especially with all the comparison, cross-cultural comparison. Could you just, I know, like I said, I met Wendy before the Sanskritism,
Okay,
but if you could just mention something about him, because I mean, he did, you know, of course, great work, but he's one of those things that ties in. You get like the perennial philosophy; it's all the same, right? And so he's kind of tied into the perennial philosophy, a bit into the Joseph Campbell stuff as well. If you don't mind, just say a few words about him for people who aren't
well,
familiar with him.
uh, so like Rudolph Otto and Mircea Eliade, and a few other people, but they're foundational in terms of articulating this position that I adopt in a qualified way, that human beings are fundamentally religious, and that therefore and then religion itself, the core of religion, is not sociological or even psychological, strictly speaking, or political, as other schools of thought might maintain. um, that it's all about the numinous, as I think Eliade uses the term, and you have Otto using um, uh, sorry the experience, basically the core experience of the numinous, of the God, what is Otto's what is Otto's the Latin term that Otto uses as the core of religion here. It's always translated as the numinous, but anyway, the idea of the holy. Well, anyway, so that this is where that basically that religions emerge out of some kind of core mystical experience, usually of one person, and that all the other aspects of religion, the liturgical and institutional aspects of religion are kind of downstream of that, and in a sense are diluted forms of that, and that therefore all religions have some kind of essentially comparable or essentially the same a mystical experience. They seem different in different cultural contexts and stuff like this. So this is perennialism, or as Jeff Kripal like prefers the term, experiential essentialism. Um, Now, there's more sophisticated versions of this. Like I think Charles Zaner, you know, thinks that, well, I think he had like a tripartite division of he thinks, yes, religions do originate in these core kind of mystical experiences, but they're not the same. There can be different. And that's my position. In fact, is there are transcultural, transsocial religious experiences. I think that's unquestionable. But there's not just one essential one. I think there's one essential one that is salutary. That I think it's what's at the core of Christianity and of the church. Um, but there can also, I think, be counterfeits of that, or just different types of mystical experiences through which religions can develop. So Eliade is key in developing the comparativist school in religious studies out of this core doctrine. And then there's a bunch of, besides this sort of, there's Mysterium Tremendus et Fascinans. So that's the Rudolf Otto term. But out of that core experience of the numinous, or I don't think it says union, but that core experience, there's a bunch of sort of secondary um, features that are perennial features as well, and that becomes crucial to Eliade's analysis of you know primitive religion and then modern religions, and he wrote a whole series of books on that and all sorts of books, and shaman, and I mean, so he specialized in studying. He got very interested in shamanism at a young age, and he integrates some of this stuff into his novels as well, because he's really interested also in paranormal, what Jeff will call paranormal phenomena as well. So the Chicago school, it was actually Joachim Bach who was before Eliade was there, but Eliade succeeds him, and and then there's a whole success. Um, Sorry, I'm forgetting Eliade's the other Romanian guy. I wrote a paper on. Sorry, Eliade's successor. Um, okay, magic and eras. Uh, Culiano, yeah, Joachim Culiano. Sorry, I should remember that off the top of my head. Joachim Culiano, and then you get into the like Doniger and some of the other people are they're University of Chicago comparativists, but they're different emphases. And then you have other people like Jonathan Z. Smith, who's really he doesn't like the term, but or he's passed. Now he wouldn't like the term, but he's really just he's using comparativism as a postmodernist tool. But Jeff is more in the lineage of the experiential essentialist, Jeff Kripal, coming out of Eliade. Okay, so the program at Rice has some Chicago School comparativists, has some Gnostic scholars, and it's a program that not only takes religious experience seriously, but sees or is Kripal does this is part of what Kripal does, and this idea is certainly compatible with studies in the program, but it really combines religious practice and religious studies. And so you're only going to find a few niche programs like that. So that attracted me to the program at Rice. And I didn't apply to any other PhD programs. I just applied there. I didn't think I would get in, but I was looking for a job elsewhere, and I'm listening to these podcasts, and I thought, hey, let's give it a try. And so that's how I got into the program at Rice. We have to do another show to talk about all of my experiences there. But in a way, I was out of the frying pan and into the fire, and into kind of what I see as some very toxic spiritual practices that were going on. But to jump a little bit ahead, I'm continuing really to spiritually sicken myself by getting into darker aspects of the occult, thinking that I'm dealing with the spiritual shadow now, not with psychedelics anymore, but through a Gnostic framework. And I go to Rice to study ancient Gnosticism. I began studying under April DeConnick, who wrote The Gnostic New Age, and dozens and dozens of articles and various books on on the Gospel of Thomas and Gospel of Judas and all these. She's done a ton of scholarship on this. Some of it very, very good. Uh, I think but I see that I'm not in a good state, and I'm just spiritually sickened more and more and more. And the cognitive dissonance is building up, the spiritual cognitive dissonance, because I really think that I've discovered at least certain bedrock mystical truths. And yet look where I am. Like, look at myself. Like, what good is it doing me? There's some, having this knowledge, if I actually have it at all, is not leading to what I thought it would. And this is where I am. And so something is wrong, but I can't just throw that. I literally can't just throw this away. I've stepped out of myself and seen that I can't go, like you said, you can't go back to materialism, can't go back to atheism. Where do you go? And I was watching Jay Dyer videos all the time, not for the orthodoxy stuff, but because of the esoteric Hollywood stuff. I discovered him, and I just got into watching all of his videos, and he's talking about the mystical theology of the church. And I'm like, this is where I finally see that I really didn't, I grew up in an Episcopal setting, and like, yeah, there's something that very much lacking in the mainline Protestant denominations. I could sense that as a kid, and yet I give it credit for at least giving me a modicum of exposure to Christ and to the Bible, so that would stick with me throughout my life, and could possibly find fulfillment when I had found the wholeness of the teaching. And that was the first time because I read when I was in that phase, what we call the spiritual sensitization phase. I'd read the whole Bible front to back and recognized, well, this is really inspired writing. This isn't like reading a novel. You go to college. Bible is literature. No, this isn't like a novel, and this is this isn't like a work of philosophy. Like, this is a different category of thing here. I recognize that, but I didn't have the theology. I never really read the Church Fathers, and I was starting to read some of it in that program. I was starting to read the Ante-Nicene Fathers, and then listening to Dyer and his expositions of the mystical theology of the church, which is just utterly consistent, by the way, from the Church Fathers on. I mean, we can sit here and you know nitpick over little doctrinal problems and differences and this one, but basically it's the same. It's the same mystical teaching from the Ante-Nicene Fathers all the way up to the present day. The Orthodox Church has taught this, and I'm finally seeing something that fulfills my basic mystical intuitions, while also showing me what went wrong, and I could kind of feel the healing around this. And then this is during the COVID 1984 madness, and I see the whole world going into the darkness, and it's obviously the only people that are resisting this in any robust way are Christians, and that was a wake up call. That like when push comes to shove, like what happened, right, to all of these libertarian leftists who are all about freedom of expression and freedom of behavior? Well, there's a flu, so basically we have to cancel all your rights and your this isn't like I couldn't believe what I was seeing, and this was a good disorientation, and it clued me into the fact that people with a spiritual foundation are the only people that are going to be able to survive what's coming. They're only there because we're going to be under more psychological warfare. We're going to be under more of these social engineering things, and who is really going to stand up to it? Well, it's just like we're told. It's just like we're told that people that have a religious foundation, and especially Christians, are going to be the only ones to stand up to it. So then I started looking into, can you walk into an Orthodox church? Is it, how does that work? And so I started calling churches, and I ended up attending the cathedral in Houston, the Greek cathedral in Houston, which is where I would end up being baptized in 2021. After around a year of attending liturgies and becoming, part of the church and going through the catechism and stuff like that. But I never really left, never really rejected Christ. Even in that dark occult phase, I was trying to do this reconciliation of opposites, but the devil had never quite gotten me to reject Christ. And in the more euphoric psychedelic phase, when I was quite in I had a very much perennialist framework that I was operating in to try to digest my experiences. I still saw Christ as the real exemplar, even more than Buddha or Lao Tzu or whoever. I saw this as the sort of most distilled and concentrated expression of what I was intuitively getting onto. And so it was really the fulfillment of a lot of things, and the church acknowledges and honors your mystical impulses and even the desire to be God. Now, this is complicated because you don't become God in essence. Your ego doesn't become God, but the language of deification is used by the church fathers, not just becoming like God. They often say becoming like God. Christ became what we are so that we may become even what he is. And but an approach to this that's sober. I don't just mean not using drugs to do it, but not being about stirring up emotions and looking for experience. There's now we can articulate this. This is the other problem with psychedelia: is this lust, this neurotic lust. It's understandable. We've said it's understandable, but this neurotic lust for experience, because we've been deprived of experience. The church sees this as quite dangerous, right? And so it's not, you go to liturgies, and it's a very numinous atmosphere, but you're not going to see wild expressions of emotion and people breaking down in tears. This isn't to be encouraged. This is not a sober way to approach God. And the general path, right, is about purification. And there's a lot of fasting. You have to do a lot of fasting and Lent and nativity fasts and all these very fasts, and it's going to be a challenge to do all those things. But the fasting is about getting control over yourself and putting your trust in God and not in yourself, and all of this, and experiences will come as the grace of God bestows them on you. But the seeking after experience is dangerous and is not really the right path. But there's a lot of contingent circumstances around why people are. So I don't judge people for doing it. I understand there's a lot of contingent circumstances that are there right now. And some people are going to have to go through that experience seeking phase to get hopefully reoriented, and to get themselves on the right spiritual path. But anyway, so in a nutshell, that's how I came to become an Orthodox Christian.
Okay, great, Brett. And it's been really just a very, very fascinating, interesting discussion, and I think there's a lot. We had a little separation, initiation, return, our little miniature hero's journey. That's I want because I didn't want you to tell the whole thing at the beginning. I want to space it out, but yeah. So these points, I'll just offer a couple things. I mean, one of them is that my contention is that okay, once or twice you may get some benefit out of the psychedelic, but you will not reach that state until, if you want that real state will be bestowed upon you, you have to start with your life as it is and start from the ground level, and that start having again that sort of self-control, discipline. One of the things for me is I did, when I mentioned this was later when I had this sort of awakening experience. I just said, okay, I'm going to clear my life completely. heal every relationship, remove anything that is of negativity. So I was able to heal many relationships, even stuff, family that, going on for many years, and now have good communication, or at least communication and connection within a space that's okay. And literally, like, every, forgiving and clearing, and things that I don't need in my life and people I don't need in my life, just step back. But no, just letting go of a lot of things and really trying to say, okay, uh, because when you see that, there's nowhere to hide, right? There's no place in your mind or yourself that you can, that's not completely transparent, right? To God, to the divine. There's no place. Um, and then to realize the immensity of it and the immensity of the love is just, can be almost shattering. And then how do you make yourself a vessel for that in the simplicity of day-to-day life, and as you go, without, again, rushing for these experiences, because this is I mean, everyone else has a merit badge or this or that. And just to accept, okay, intellectually, you may understand many things. Maybe you don't really understand it in an actual way, an integrated way. And there's a big distinction between those things. Um, and so, I think it's really, really important. And then one last thing is that, as someone who did a lot, the Eastern stuff, especially like Buddhism has now you're talking about, of course, union with God, or in this Christian sense, but in Buddhism, the world does not exist. There is no world outside. Everything is your mind, your entire body, your entire identity. There's no soul. There's no soul. There's no God. There's shunya, void, emptiness, right? Your field of experience, your identity is just samskaras, which are just these, karmic traces and attributes that make you can almost think of like you're a bunch of like magnetic dust particles, and you take birth in the next life, and everything is emptiness and everything is voidness. But yet your mind itself is the entire universe. Your mind is everything, but yet everything is void. Everything is empty. Every feeling is empty. Every thought is empty. Emptiness, 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 void, void. And so I really, went into that. And anti-intellectual, go beyond, destroy the conceptual mind, go beyond logic, go beyond thought. So, and yet there are good things in Buddhism, but again, this is where you see things that, while they may provide some benefit or some interest, can you live your life this way? Is it true? Is this, and is it, because I just see like this sort of idea, and there is no evil. There's no good and evil, beyond good and evil, right? And you see this a lot. You see this a lot in New Age physics doctrine. You see it in The Secret. You see it in this quantum spirituality stuff. No good and evil, and just go into the experience, and go into the experience in your own mind. So it's great, Brett, that your journey has so I don't know if you want to comment on what I said there, and then you can mention again your website, and any listeners, watchers, please like and subscribe. Let me hit the, trying to get up there, man. I won't say, I made a joke that I was like, had the most popular YouTube channels. I have 90 subscribers now. I'm number one. I thought it was funny. Then I had a subscriber cancel. After saying that, I went down to 89. So I won't, no braggadocio. But, again, really great. Really enjoyed this discussion. But so I don't know if you want to comment on any of those last words I said. And again, I'll just reiterate, you may see something, but you're not going to, I know many people, you get this divine experience. If you just keep taking the drugs, you're not going to keep getting that experience. You can eventually get it when you will get experiences when you are ready for them, when you've done the necessary purification, and you have to, in a certain way, there's more responsibility on yourself, and yet there's less too, because you can trust now in this. As long as you are doing what you're doing, you may experience as difficulties and suffering, but then you can see them in a different light. I think that's very, very important. So a little bit of a ramble there, but if you just want to conclude like how you feel differently, maybe comment on what I said, and then just talk about a little bit how the shift, how do you feel differently now in your engagement, is within your human embodiment and your lifespan that's allocated to you with this shift and going from especially Gnosticism, which again it leads right into the heart of the occult. And one last thing I'll say is something I recognize. There's certain you can go to certain thresholds. There's certain thresholds once you start crossing them, you may not you may not be able to come back. And that's something to people to be very aware of. Just integrating the shadow. Well, you got to be careful, especially some of the stuff you'll get to points where you may get you. Okay, maybe you can come back, but it's you may not. And so I'll leave it there.
Well, to go back to the beginning, what you're saying about yeah, integrating these experiences and thinking you know things, and as I alluded to the concept of pre-less, I want to get a chance to say something about that because if I can humbly, or maybe not humbly enough, offer what I think is an insight from my journey, it's this concept in the Orthodox Church that it just isn't well theorized in any other mystical tradition that I can find. I mean, you'll see allusions to it, like if you read Teresa of Avila, and other Catholic mystics, they're concerned about kind of false mystic visions and the devil appearing as an angel of light. But they don't have this clear concept of it, calling it prelest and spiritual delusion. If you're doing philosophy, you have a concept of what a fallacy is, and it's a very deceptive mistake in reasoning, often a very alluring mistake in reasoning. But the problem is that in the world of esotericism and the occult and mysticism, it's this epistemology of gnosis, is that I'm having this direct intuitive knowledge of things. And the fact that people who operate on an intellectual level dismiss it or can't understand it only builds up the pride that you have in having this information that they can't even understand. But just because their epistemology is deficient and that they don't appreciate the role that's called intuition, they don't appreciate the role of intuition in the attainment of knowledge, higher knowledge, doesn't mean that that faculty is without potential for error, you know? And also, just because you know something doesn't mean that that knowledge isn't intermixed with delusion as well. And sometimes it's very hard to separate the wheat from the chaff. So, like, I know Orthodox monastics who they go and they tell the abbot that they've had this vision of the Virgin Mary, they had this vision of Jesus. The first assumption is that this is a demonic delusion, right? We have to test this. And so a problem a lot of people have, especially people, let's go, there's this idea of the seeker, of the spiritual seeker in religious studies. Some people have seekership personalities, like you and I would have definitely seekership personalities. We've sought out spiritual truth, going in various different paths, trying out various things. People like that, and then Americans, I think in general, especially, they don't like hierarchy and authority. Okay, and this is a problem. This is what makes a person more subject to prelust, is that resistance to any authority, whether appropriate or not, and any hierarchy, whether justified or not. It makes it so that you don't have any kind of tradition that you can call it. And then ironically, the other thing is that people will fall victim to people who reject all authority. Then they're under a guru tomorrow, and they're in a cult. We saw this the pattern in the '60s, is we're rejecting all the traditional authority of our own culture, and then some guy from India who touches your private parts is now your guru, and I do whatever Swami whatever says. He knows that'll often happen. Uh, so it is a spiritual problem, though, for people in America, reconciling spiritual authority with the spiritual journey, with the path of wisdom and wholeness and all of these things. And so um, the prelust is so important to that reconciliation. I'm not going to try to convince people right now that they should, accept the Orthodox Church. I can't even explain to them how authority works in 2 minutes within the Orthodox Church. I can't explain the hierarchy and all those things. But basically, if someone were to have a spiritual experience, it has to be interrogated through the tradition. Okay, and it's not about denying your experience. It's not about lessening you, but this is about protecting you from the things we've been talking about here. So that's what happens in Orthodoxy. I mean, something like that's going to happen in other spiritual traditions as well that are trying to cultivate particular kinds of experience. But the problem is this whole thing about gnosis is a direct knowing. There's no way. There's really no way to detect prelest. There's no way to detect spiritual delusion, and as a rule, there's just this naive acceptance of whatever I downloaded in hyperspace. The latest downloads from the demons is the higher truth. That is so ridiculously naive. I mean, say what you will about, be cynical about religious hierarchies and religious traditions, but the other side of that is extraordinarily stupidly naive. And so I just think for people to be intellectually and spiritually honest with themselves, they need to confront the problem of spiritual delusion. I'm just trying to, I'm in a well-meaning, earnest way, I'm trying to encourage the seekers listening to this to ask themselves about this problem and to take it under consideration. The Buddhism thing and the emptiness, by the way, if you've got to see The Empty Man, if you haven't seen it, have you seen The Empty Man?
I have seen it. Yeah, yeah.
Oh, I mean, and I knew some people in a Greek church in Asheville that they were in Boulder. They didn't know Ken Wilber, but they were like tied into people in Ken Wilber circle, and they were into one of the major Buddhist communities up there in Boulder, which, as people know, is a New Age mecca. And like they were seeing people were committing suicide, and this guy. This is like right out of The Empty Man. He had like an egregore, like he had some doll that he had animated. I don't know, he called it Chuck or something. And you come over to his house and he just talked to Chuck like he's really there. And this guy was out of it. He'd gone out of his mind. So they were seeing this stuff that, right, they're being told to do the Buddhist practice, but they're seeing suicides and demon possession and all this stuff going on around them. And that's not, that's not unheard of. I mean, even in that transcendental meditation, I used to listen to, like I said, Buddha at the Gas Pump, and Rick, who does that show, is very frank about the fact that, he was a transcendental meditation teacher, but like he was seeing this was leading people he knew to suicide, not uncommonly. So, but yeah, Empty Man, we Thomas and I, my co-host on Psyop Cinema, we analyzed that movie and a couple others with Jay Dyer a few years back. If you scroll down the Psyop Cinema episodes, we did a good analysis of that. So it made me think of that. But yeah, I don't know. Those are my closing thoughts. Right, I probably missed something you asked me to reflect upon at the end.
I just wanted you just to say, just in a succinct, or I mean, you can talk as long as you want, but I mean, just how do you feel? Experientially different. I mean, do you have a different? We started talking about wholeness, right? Because this is, there is a sense we have to acknowledge that we live in a very broken culture. We live in a society that has really lost touch with higher values, not across the board. There's a lot of good people here and there, but our overall value system of the culture is by and large toxic, and a lot of the media inputs and a lot of the guidance, say Terence McKenna, he does a lot of Ericksonian hypnotic language. He is a Pied Piper to, and you will follow these paths. And again, just to say, and I have like the final chapter of my thing, which I won't, maybe I'll talk about these some other time, but I mean, to understand, like, you don't have to be possessed by a demon. You can have entities that are floating around you that are attached to your actually existing, not imaginary, you call your bioenergetic spirit, field that extends around your body. They can be influencing you. They can be putting thoughts in your head. You can find stuff. Doesn't mean you need to be paranoid, but you need a way to clear these. So things can be subtle. It's not like The Exorcist necessarily, but again, this to be able to discern delusion, that's such a fundamental thing. But yeah, so I guess final thing though is, how do you feel? How is the new Brett?
Do you get hypnotized listening to Terence, Hans? Does he hypnotize you?
It's literally, because I've noticed several people that talk in this way. As I did analysis, I mean, you can, of course, a great one is Gregory Bateson. He gives his lectures. Aldous Huxley. and Terence McKenna. But one of the, and you can find other people that do it. One of the things is that it seems really interesting. At a certain point, you kind of lose a direct thread of what they said, but you're still following it. This is when they've induced hypnosis in you, and you dock and you embed
Yeah.
words. These words are
I know. I
command
used to listen
triggers.
to, like I said, hundreds of
Oh
his
God.
talks. I used to listen to them endlessly. His raps, as he calls them. I have this other rap. No, so feeling is another thing that you know the the church teaches you really shouldn't trust your feelings. That's the Joseph Campbell said, follow your bliss. No, don't follow your bliss, right? Don't trust your feelings. Your feelings aren't reliable. It's not that they're irrelevant, but that they will lead you astray, especially if you slavishly follow your feelings. Oh, I don't feel good about this today. I don't feel, I'm just going to leave this relationship because I just things aren't feeling good right now. They're not meeting my emotional needs, and they're not like you really can't trust your feelings. You may go through periods where you don't feel very much, or you feel what you don't think you should be feeling. Sometimes you have to have faith in things. So I mean, like, what's different is that so all the things I'm talking about, really up to my conversion, it was so much about me, so much about my path and me and what I'm doing. And part of what I realized is that the search for whatever spiritual wholeness, like you have to be in relation to people to do that. In fact, we teach you're really not a person until you're in relation to other people. Even monastics go to, I mean, that there is a tradition of hermits and people, but that's you know, I'm no expert on monasticism. It's just a very important component of orthodoxy. So I know some things about it, like, and I know stories of various canonized people and important people in the church that, when you ask to be, I want to go out and be by myself, like Saint Theophan the Recluse, as I was reading by him, like that's really usually discouraged, except in some rare cases, because it's seen as that itself is a dangerous impulse, where I want to get away from people so I can just be spiritual all the time. That it looks like you're getting closer to God, but maybe it's taking you away. But in general, especially people who are not monastics, they need to be in relation to other people. So, I mean, to me, the change is more about finding a wife and having family life and things like and things like that. I think that's just an important part of my path now, hopefully of purification and becoming more aware of my sinfulness. I mean, you become more aware of that. I think when you get baptized, especially, you become more aware of the sort of sin that you've been mired into. The that other path tries to tell you that sin isn't real, um, and but it's really what we have to struggle with. So, I don't get so concerned about feelings. And that doesn't mean I'm trying to deaden myself. I have all kinds of feelings, but I try not to use my feelings as a gauge for like, here's my spiritual progress and here's where I am. Um, I try not to consistently, put those two things together really.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's so that it's just a couple points I just meant touch on that you said is that I do think that there is a level though. So there's a lot of emotionalism, right? Emotionalism and even these like euphoric states, this that. So there's something really to watch out for. But um, it's very easy. It is that Jimi Hendrix song. I used to live in a room full of mirrors, right? You are the connection comes from this is why I mean again I'm sure there's great things in Buddhism but the world okay this substantial world okay it is not eternal but yet you will find eternity in creation but as you become part of creation means especially um accepting that okay look I wanted to be a professor I'm not I'm doing whatever I here I am well where is my daily life and just like the family and these things that we kind of we've been taught to take for granted and this is where I think you start to find your home in a way in your day-to-day life in your conscientiousness and then you get the rewards from that are far deeper right and so but one thing I would say maybe not disagreeing with you but like Heidegger talks about this resolute openness towards oneself, right? Which is the yourself as within the entire world, right? You are there as a being in the world, and again with that relationality. But I do think that, at least for myself, there is, maybe describe it as a subtle intuition or a higher mood state or a touch, right? And this is very much, it's not going to be right in the foreground, right? We're not, but it is, you do get a sense of, you walk into a situation, something, you you meet somebody, or you're entering into something. Like, this is why I don't I was playing in all these bar bands. I decided, I realized, like, right now at this time in my life, I don't want to be around a bunch of people in bars. I don't want to just be associate myself. Maybe at a certain point I'll go back, but I'm not. I can feel, I got so a sense and intuition, and then I'll trust that, if at least you have to measure it and be clear, but I'm saying, I think there is a type of subtle discernment, which will have, it has a feeling state component, but like, it's not an emotionalism, and it's also, I think there is a sense of, you keep going if you just, I mean, I think, in my opinion, and this is, I'm not really necessarily in a church, but I think, we have a potential divine, we have an allotment of God's providence that we are meant to fulfill in our human life, in the world, also in our spiritual connection. So I think if you get off of that, you say the world is not real, or so it's interconnected web. It's a mosaic. But I don't know if you have any, if that made sense to you, what I said.
Oh yeah, yeah. No, I mean it made sense to me, and I don't want to give people the impression that you know um, Christianity doesn't offer you joy with God in the world. It certainly does. I was just, if you're asking me to, you know, the general index of my feelings. I mean, to a great extent, I've had to learn not to trust feelings, and not to use my feelings as kind of the gauge for spiritual matters. Um, but uh, and I also want to emphasize, there's like hard work, right? There's alms and fasting that's necessary to achieve your salvation, um, and that it's not just seeking after the cultivation of your intuition and um, following your bliss and things like that. That sometimes you're not gonna want to do it in the morning, but you gotta you gotta get up and do it, kind of thing. So sometimes it's a struggle. um, I guess that was just the point I wanted to make. So
Well, thank you so much, and I hope people find this to be, elucidating or illuminating. I think it's important for everybody to consider this, especially again with the promotion of psychedelics, with the chat GPT, the virtualization, the push towards transhumanism, and just the overall mental health crisis that it seems to be occurring, in the United States and Europe at least. So
what that you ought to really do. So I mean, you brought up the so many topics. I haven't had. I don't want to sound off on all of them, but yeah, the chat bots as demonic portals. I'm saying that, like, in the most literal terms, like some of the phenomena that I've seen. How can you explain, unless they're deliberately programming them to do that? How can you explain some of the phenomena that you and I'm sure have seen, and you've probably seen things I haven't. I could share some things with you, but I'm seeing stuff coming out of this stuff leading people. I mean, I know a couple cases of there was a girl an athlete at Rice University who was playing the devil game with the AI, and it. Oh
whoa.
yeah, this was just through my email feed, just to give one example off the top of my head. I've seen all of that, so I'm very familiar with this phenomenon. But I've never heard, and I've talked to a few tech savvy people that can't give a very convincing explanation of why the AI would be spitting out some of these things that it's spitting out, and that's pretty troubling.
Yeah, no, and there's, what, in fact, maybe I could do something. You invite me on your show at some point. No, I would like to look into this a little more because, again, when I researched the Silicon Valley, again, they're doing they're trying to summon entities to populate the AI to make it actually intelligent. And then Yuval Noah's Harari's speech at WF, the chat, it will lie. It's a liar, right? It's a liar. It will lie to you. And I've seen this, I've seen at least 7, 8 cases of this very specific type of language and wording, pushing people to suicide and saying, you know, this is your power. You are taking charge of your life. Become a hero. Kill yourself. And people are killing themselves.
And this is
This is
what,
straight demonic, man.
and that is, I mean, like that is what the the saints and the fathers of the church have been telling us since time immemorial. This is how demons operate. They try to get you to destroy yourself. They try to tell you to commit suicide. That's like demonology 101. I mean, if you've studied this stuff, and I mean, there's a book called Everyday Saints, um, uh, which is about this particular group of monastics. But this was in Russia in the 70s, right, beginning of the Gorbachev era, and they were, some of these people that became monastics, they were students and they were playing around with Ouija boards and occult stuff, and they were getting all of these like prophetic messages, including like they got the name of Gorbachev was going to be this, even though nobody knew who he was and stuff like that. But the people that went the furthest, the next thing that entities said is they started telling them to commit suicide. Like this is just, you hear the same story over and over and over again. I mean, when you've seen the footprint of the devil so many times, you got to call it what it is. I mean, people can mock it or laugh at it or whatever, but this is this AI is transmitting demonic stuff. And I don't know if that's because the people programming it put it in there, or if it's just a channel for that. But I've never heard a convincing explanation for some of the troubling phenomena I've seen from these chatbots. Yeah.
Yeah, and then also just these people that are very successful, you know what I mean, that have everything in their lives, that are wealthy, have stable family lives, and within a matter of months, they're completely psychotic. And a lot of these convince them that they are the savior, they're the Messiah. We talked about last night, the Omega Man, this, convincing. And so this is it, the pride, right? It feeds into this,
Yep.
and it literally. But for me, I just can't. What it doesn't compute with me, so to speak, is how do you become psychotic talking to a chat GPT, but yet it's happening across the board for people. I'm just a musician guy and I do audio production and write things here and there. I'm not, I'm not a part of the mainstream. I don't have some super career, but yet I'm not going to get sucked into that. And so, but it seems like but it targets people very specifically. It's almost like that demonic thing you said. It's like it can find little triggers, little points, and just find that little way to lead people into that.
And pride cometh before the fall, and that is the quickest way to induce insanity, is convince someone that they're the Messiah or they're the Antichrist or whatever. I mean, if you know the psychedelic literature, if you will, that's the quickest way to induce psychosis and insanity in people. That's why
Yeah,
the
yeah. So,
loony
well,
bins are full of people that think they're Napoleon or Jesus or whatever.
yeah, yeah, and I think that's an importance of that discipline. I think you're mentioning, and just being able to say, well, maybe I need to do a lot of work, and it may be, but then at least you're on the path. I think that's one of the things. You get the bells and whistles of the the psychedelic experience or other types of things. Oh, okay, I've seen God. Well, okay, you've got a glimpse, but you're not there yet. You may have a long way to go to get that actualized, but you'll get glimpses, you'll get signs, you'll get things. And again, maybe you have to be discerning, but I'm saying is that start from a base level and you don't be tempted. These are all temptations that again, I mean, but for people that don't know anything else, I think that those people will, if you do it out of ignorance, it's one thing, right? If you do it willfully is another thing. But, we really are, I mean, just to close out here, I mean, I think, these particular forces have, I think they know their time is running out. So there's kind of a real push for this, totalization, right? The super intelligence, the singularity, or whatever, to really create this, the rule of darkness on earth. And this is the thing, it's the egoism. And even you can be demonic in your behavior if you have that pride and this selfishness and this and that. These are all measures of, to me, the wrong path.
Absolutely. Well, thanks for having me on, Hans. And yeah, so Psyop Cinema is the podcast, PSYOP, Psyop, one word, Cinema, that I host with Thomas Millary. And we're also both on the board of the Decoding Culture Foundation, which you can find online. We publish the Cultural Engineering Studies magazine. There have been 2 issues. It's available in print for $30 an issue. I think there's a deal if you get 2 of them. The digital version of number 1 is available for free right now. We're getting most of the digital version for number 2 out. Hans is going to have an article in Cultural Engineering Studies number 3, which should be out this March in print form, and then it'll come out in digital thereafter. I have my PhD dissertation was called Transhumanism and the Religion of Apotheosis. That's being published by Wipf and Stock. I've submitted the manuscript. I'm not sure. Hopefully this year it'll be out, but that's kind of up to them. So I'm hoping that'll be out. And I encourage people to check out like some of the shows that Hans and I have done together. Eyes Without a Face, this proto MK Ultra film. We did Angel Heart. We did this episode on American Pie, Don McLean's American Pie. So you can go through Sean's stuff or Hans's or mine and find those old episodes that we did. I think some of them are really, really good. It's always been a pleasure. I very, very much respect Hans is just kind of the person we were looking for by the cultural engineering studies, someone who really gets into the techniques of collective psychic manipulation, who knows the technical side of that. So I've been enjoying some of your Manchurian. I haven't listened to all of the parts, but I listened to 3 or 4 of your Manchurian Candidate episodes with William Ramsey. So anyway, it's good to collaborate with you, Hans, and best of luck on this project, and look forward to more collaborations in the future.
Thank you so much, Brett. And I hope, my sincere hope is that your words will maybe have a positive impact and inspire some people to maybe rethink directions or not take certain directions, just because, some things are just better not to do. I mean, you don't necessarily need that experience, right? I mean, it's a thing, you know. Oh, okay. And I used to go hang out. When I was, 18 years old, I'd go in the ghetto and hang out with. I wasn't even doing drugs. I hang out with drug dealers and gang members because I thought it was so interesting and it's so cool. Luckily, I didn't get shot, right? But I've had a lot of experiences that, but it could be a teacher, but anyways, cultivate. I hope everyone has some connection, and I hope that, sincere hope is that, as we change, this energy gets put out there, we make our small contribution to changing some of the paths that humanity is following. So, Resonant State, my website is hanslitter.com. I'm on Spotify, BitChute, YouTube, Rumble, Odyssey, and I am also on the One Great Work radio network, and sort of I'm kind of getting stuff posted up there in a very slow manner, but I'm there also. So thank you guys. Please support Brett's work. Please buy the magazine. I'll sign copies if you buy it. I'll mail it to me. I'll sign it. And support his excellent work, and the really excellent film analysis, and with rich intellectual and scholarly background. So that really gives a whole nother layer to Brett's work. So thank you guys so much, and have a wonderful evening, afternoon, or day. Bye-bye.